Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
Welcome to Highest Power Church and State. I'm Rick Pidcock, and this is episode 44. It's hard to believe it's been 44 episodes already, but it has, and I've been really enjoying being able to talk about some of the news about religion and politics today in this setting besides the articles that I typically put out every week. So in this particular episode, I want to talk about my article this week, which was about a religious trauma coach and therapist named Laura Anderson. And the article was titled, Licensing Agency Finds Religious Trauma Coach in Violation of Code of Ethics. It was published on July 28th by Baptist News Global. And Laura Anderson was, as you can see in the title there of the article, she was sanctioned by the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapists, the AAMFT, for violating their code of ethics on boundaries. And the reason this is a big story is because she is a very prominent figure in progressive Christian and ex-evangelical spaces. She's the author of When Religion Hurts You, Healing from Religious Trauma and the Impact of High Control Religion. You'll see her book mentioned in a lot of other books as a resource that people have used. She's also appeared on at least 75 different deconstruction-related podcasts in progressive Christianity or in the ex-evangelical space. And her story is connected to the series of stories that I had been working on earlier this year related to the New Evangelicals organization, and this is kind of an ongoing update of that. So some people have wondered why I decided to work on this piece, and I've seen some in the more atheist and ex-evangelical community are skeptical, especially when they see an organization called Baptist News writing about a religious trauma therapist, and they'll assume that Rick is not a friend of the ex-evangelical community. Rick and these women are Baptists trying to take down those who deconstruct from religious trauma. And that's not at all the case. And so I wanted to clarify, one, why I wrote the piece, and then kind of give a recap and get into some of the development of the piece and some clarifications and some of the responses and kind of where to go from here. So basically, I'm not trying to take down the ex-evangelical community by sowing doubt in a qualified expert. On a practical level, basically, this story was a continuation of the New Evangelicals story, in which Anderson, that I wrote about back in March and in April, was named as the mediator in this controversy that the New Evangelicals were in. And it's really about continuing to address the hierarchies that harm people on the underside of power. Because a lot of us who are on the underside of power and who have experienced religious trauma, we wonder where to turn to help us process these wounds. And sometimes therapists may not quite understand some of the theological and cultural nuances that we've experienced. And I know that some people have felt safer going to these religious trauma coaches, and especially those who are no longer Christian, because it feels like they're not trying to get you back into any particular brand of Christianity again. And so when you open up to these people and you start to process these wounds that you've carried from being in the church, it can be very shocking to discover, what if the person you're going to is also abusive, despite having left the church, despite having left Christianity. And so a lot of people can experience an extra harm in that. And so it's important for us, for those people who have experienced religious trauma, to make sure that we're not continuing to perpetuate those power dynamics and harming even more people. And given the prominence of Laura Anderson and how so many people recommend her, it was important to address these things. So to do a recap so far of what has happened this year, The story began in March when Tim Whitaker, who founded the New Evangelicals organization, which is basically a social media organization that has amassed, at the time, 323,000 followers. I'm not sure where they're at right now. But basically, it came out in March that there was a Grace report, and Grace is the organization Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. And the Grace report was about an angry driving incident involving Tim Whitaker and a woman who was contracted with the New Evangelicals, to where the woman felt very unsafe in the car, and she felt that her concerns weren't being taken seriously enough afterward. She talked about Whitaker having anger and exploding in anger at her over the phone. So Grace released this report. And one of the things that was mentioned in the report was that during their talks between Whitaker and the New Evangelicals and this woman, Whitaker suggested that they have a mediator who is Laura Anderson. So Whitaker and Anderson gave the impression to the victim that they didn't really know each other that well. And yet then when they were having one of their mediation meetings, when the victim went away from her computer, she overheard Whitaker and Anderson laughing together in a way that felt very much more friendly than a third-party mediator situation should be. Then also that very day, Whitaker and Anderson were releasing content together with TNE. So the Grace report said that there was a conflict of interest there, and both Whitaker and the New Evangelicals agreed. But we never heard from Anderson. Another thing about this, too, was there was a lot of lack of communication in this. For example, the New Evangelicals had just started a new show called The Tim and April Show with April LaJoy, and she had no idea that there was a Grace investigation going on. Also, Whitaker was reaching out to other women who were influential podcasters at the time, trying to start a podcasting network, and others, not just women, but people who talk about issues that those who have experienced religious trauma would come to. They were trying to start a podcast network, and he had never told any of them about the Grace report investigation. And so I wrote that first piece because I knew that people were going to respond to this story with all these details in it and say those who deconstruct patriarchy and hierarchy were no better, and that you might as well just stay in those systems, basically. And I didn't want those who experienced religious trauma to feel the pressure to stay in traumatic spaces. And so my suggestion in that first piece that I wrote back in March was that we haven't gone far enough in deconstructing because we still embody traces of patriarchy in our relationships and in our ways of doing things. And I figured since Whitaker and the New Evangelicals both said at the time that they agreed with the findings of the Grace Report, I thought this would be a very fair piece for us to reflect on that shouldn't really be that controversial. But within 14 minutes of the piece releasing, Whitaker called me on the phone. He was rather forceful in his tone and comments, said things like, "I'm going to do you a favor and show you all these things you got wrong." But then when we got into it, and I opened up the article and was asking, okay, so what in this article is factually wrong? There wasn't anything that he could really show me. The main concern had to do with my use of the word abuse. And yet, as I pointed out in the second piece where I give an update to everything, the women that were involved in the Grace Report used the word abuse. The Grace Report recommended training on abuse. Whitaker himself in the report said, "I'm very tuned in. I follow abuse cases. I'm aware." And Grace gave the victim a debriefer who also said reportedly said it was abuse. And so there were burner accounts going on at the time, coming after me anonymously and different things. And so that ended up leading to a follow-up piece that was and a response piece from BNG's executive director, Mark Wingfield, because people, were accusing me of spreading falsehoods. And so Wingfield said, quote, "It is BNG's policy to correct factual errors in our content as soon as we are made aware of errors. 5 days after publication of the first article, no one has contacted BNG to ask for correction, and no errors in our reporting have been identified. And to this day, nobody's been able to demonstrate any of that. So that's some of the background, but I was curious about the mediator side of the story because Anderson is a major player, and the accusations were kind of a big deal involving her, and she wasn't saying anything. And not just the accusations about the conflict of interest, but there was also a footnote in the Grace report. And after the Grace investigators interviewed Anderson for their investigation, Anderson, the Grace report says, emailed them, noting the likely overlap in cases you work on with the types of clients we see, she said, and suggesting, quote, future collaboration or professional connection, e.g. referrals, between her organization and Grace. In other words, she was attempting to spin the Grace investigation into future business for herself. And so the Grace report said in this footnote, quote, mediator's failure to recognize the potential conflict of interest in her suggestion so quickly after being interviewed as a witness and a theoretical independent mediator on a case for which Grace was performing an active investigation further underscores an underappreciation of actual or perceived conflicts of interest and their potential impact on independence in evaluating and handling interpersonal dynamics. And that was quite significant. Like, how could someone who is supposedly so aware of religious trauma demonstrate that lack of awareness and not address it when Whitaker and the New Evangelicals were both talking about it? Like, as much as I disagreed with some of the ways Tim Whitaker and the New Evangelicals were responding to the Grace report, at least they talked about it. And when Grace said there was a conflict of interest regarding Laura Anderson being the mediator, we heard both Whitaker and the New Evangelicals admitting that was true, but we never heard from Anderson. And her silence was the first sign for me that her story needed to be looked into, given what the Grace report said about her. So I started talking to people who were connected to the story and started asking about Anderson. I started getting feedback like, have you talked with this person or this person? And then some people started reaching out to me because the fact that I had written the first two pieces, some people were like, have you looked into the mediator? Have you looked into Anderson? And next thing I know, I had contact with 7 women who had very varying levels of interaction with her. And I will clarify these were not like 7 of her best friends. These were not 7 employees. These were 7 people with a variety of connections to her. And, obviously some of them would have been employed. Some of them would have been friends, as I said. Different types of interactions they've had with her. But they were all people who came to me with feelings of blurred boundaries, concerns about how they were treated to some degree, some more so than others. And so I wanted to add a clarification here. The big headline in this story, obviously there were some pretty wild stories in this piece about Anderson, but the one that we waited for to publish the piece was the AAMFT finding her guilty of those 2 violations. And some people have had questions about those, so I wanted to clarify what I understand about the dual relationships in the violations, what they were. So I will fully admit that this section of my article is a weak spot in the article. My understanding is that the complainant in the case that was brought forward was simultaneously being a practitioner at Laura's company and an academic intern. And so that's going to lead to issues because interns for school have required hours they're supposed to do. They can't be paid, whereas practitioners can be paid. And so my understanding is that there were allegations of intentionally reworded contracts, as well as Anderson charging the complainant for clients that the complainant didn't actually receive pay for. And you could see with those 2 different setups how there would be some issues there. So this led to the AAMFT charging Anderson with 4 violations. For those who are in the know, in the Code of Ethics, it's 4.1, 4.6, 4.8, and 8.4. They charged her with those violations in September of 2024. And then they were to notify the parties of the outcome. And if Anderson was found guilty, she would have 30 days to appeal. My understanding is that Anderson lost her case, though I don't know how many of those 4 charges she lost, and that she appealed them. And then on July 23rd, 2025, the AAMFT told the complainant that they were sanctioning Anderson for 2 of the violations. So there's a possibility that Anderson was originally found in violation of all 4 and appealed them and got the violations down to 2. But because there's very little public data available from the AAMFT, I'm not aware of any way to find that out. And when Anderson went on Threads to respond to some of this, she said that she never disputed the dual relationship. And that doesn't really make sense, because if she appealed the decision, then she would have been disputing it. And so if she appealed the decision, then either she's now lying about never disputing the dual relationship part of it, or she was originally found guilty of all 4 charges and is now pretending like that never happened. So all of that is extremely confusing to sort through, especially for those of us who are not therapists. And I was concerned that if I tried opening the article by getting into all of those financial and contract details, that I might say something that wasn't true. And I thought a lot of readers would probably get confused about all that too. So I figured that readers would at least understand the idea of charges and a guilty verdict. So that's what I, hung my hat on in that part of the piece. Was there were charges by an official organization, and they found her guilty of violating their code of ethics on 2 counts. So I think that this part of the story was especially valuable because it showed that there were actual violations of ethics recognized by the AAMFT, and this wasn't just 7 people with an agenda coming. There is the Grace investigation. There is the AAMFT. These are actual professionals who have recognized that there were things being done that were unethical, that were wrong, that were conflicts of interest. And so if I hadn't written the piece, then nobody would have ever found any of this had happened. And to me, that's a big problem, because there are people's lives involved who are processing their religious trauma, not just for these women, but for people that are recommended to her through all of the different podcasts and all of the different references to her books. And so what I did in that section of the piece was I quoted the standards that the AAMFT said she violated, and then I quoted her response. And I wish I could have made a more clearer case as to how it went down, but there would be risks in me saying things that weren't true. And I thought it would be easier to all of us to just realize, okay, there were charges, there were violations. But yes, I understand people are going to have questions about that section of the piece, and I understand that that is a weakness in the piece there. So I wanted to offer some of that clarification. Hopefully that helps. So the response from Anderson after the piece came out, one, she started posting like normal to social media. She posted a thing about virginity isn't a value, it's a social construct. Thoughts? And it's like, is this really the time to be talking about the definition of virginity? I don't think so. And then also, she briefly went on social media to confront people, and she called me a quote-unquote journalist. She said, "How have these claims been substantiated? I've never even spoken to Rick about them." And somebody responded and said, "I mean, do you not have 2 ethics violations you were found guilty of and made a comment to him about?" And she responded to that and said, "I made a singular email comment about the ethics violations, which were for engaging in a dual relationship, someone who was an academic intern and a coach. I never disputed this. Rick did not ask me about anything else. If you're doing a hit piece on someone, wouldn't it be good to actually talk to them? See if there's another side, see if apologies have been made, see what the evidence is." So I wanted to just say to this, I have access to an unbelievable amount of evidence from a variety of sources. This evidence includes pages upon pages of Laura's own words. So it wasn't just the word of the women, and also about the women, a number of them, they didn't even know each other. By no means were they working together, and were they in cahoots for this. So I didn't publish the story without finding out Laura's side of it. I'm very aware of her side of it. I've read her side in all of these pages. And given what I read, on top of the findings of Grace and the AAMFT, I chose to trust the women. There's just no way that Grace, the AAMFT, and these 7 women all are having these experiences, and I'm seeing these patterns in Laura's words in response to all of these things, and it's all lining up. So it would make no sense not to trust the women in this. And so I quoted her to some degree without quoting her extensively enough to re-traumatize the women. And then regarding the 2 violations of the AAMFT Code of Ethics that I had no access to her thoughts on, I asked her. So she can't spin this as if I didn't consider the evidence. I considered so much evidence in this that I had to step away from the story for about a month because the whole thing was a lot of trauma and detail to sort through. And also, I want to say, I get this from abusive people that I write about, where they want to go on my article and give all of their side against the victims. And I just want to say that my article about an abuser is not a platform for the abuser to re-traumatize the victims. I'll do all the homework I need to in the background. I spent hours upon hours upon hours reading things, doing interviews. I'm not going to allow my article, though, to be a platform for them to accuse the victims of things again, to gaslight people. I'm going to be careful in how I write the piece, so as not to reinforce the power dynamics the piece is supposed to be exposing, if that makes sense. So the response that I've seen from others to the piece, one person, I was interested in what therapists would have to say about this and what other people in the know would have to say. I figured there would probably be people who had experiences that would come out and say things. I figured there would probably be therapists who would have some insights. One person said, "I'm sharing this here because I was a co-interviewee on one of the cited podcasts that I referred to in my piece." And they said, "The comments blurring the very distinct line between therapy and coaching were concerning at best." I cited a podcast in my piece that Anderson had went on where she was talking about blurred boundaries. And so this person, after her experience with Anderson on that podcast, she said, "I went to my coaching mentor after the call to make sure I was seeing things objectively. And when it was clear I had not misunderstood, I stopped referring people to Laura's book, website, or services." Because in their podcast, Laura was downplaying boundaries as a fundamentalist, black and white thinking, rules-based type relationship. And that was very concerning for this person. Another response I got was this person said, "Thanks for this work. I'm a psychologist working with religious trauma, and I'm so disturbed. I've worked with Laura before and had a gut feeling something was off, and I hate that it was confirmed, but glad you're giving a voice to the victims and making people aware. Thank you." Another person said, "Anderson has so many red flags, she's basically a carnival. I'm a licensed physical therapist. Even if I were sanctioned by the state licensure board, you'd never hear a word from me about it on social media. Like, your patients can see this." Referring to her making these statements on social media, being accusatory and defensive and on all that stuff. And then another well-known New York Times best-selling historian said, "Honestly, her own words are far more damning than anything written about her." And then Crispin Mayfield, who is a therapist, he said on Instagram, he said, "What do you do with the work of a creator that you discover has been unethical, coercive, or abusive?" Then he said, "After the Baptist News Global article by Rick Pidcock about Laura Anderson's ethical violations and intimidating behavior, people have been asking me how they should approach her book. I believe that's for individuals to decide. Let's get away from authoritarianism. For me, I've never recommended her book because the first chapter includes a story about beginning a romantic relationship with a high schooler when she was 4 years older. I know she says she didn't start the relationship until after he was graduated, but clearly there was a romantic element prior, which at best felt out of place in a book about religious trauma and felt too similar to stories like Connie Baker's, author of Traumatized by Religious Abuse. I've included this part straight out of Anderson's book, Image 2, so you can read it yourself." So in chapter 1 of Anderson's book, she tells the story. She says, quote, "A few years into my position at the church, I was still single, and a mutual interest developed between one of the other leaders and me. Unfortunately, Lucas was 4 years my junior, and finishing his senior year of high school, we decided that nothing could happen between us until he graduated a couple months later. Since we were both committed to living a life of purity in body, heart, and mind, I informed Trey of my interest in Lucas. He was enraged and threatened harsh consequences if I acted on my interest. When Lucas graduated from high school, Trey informed other church leaders of my plans to allow Lucas to pursue a relationship with me, and they decided that I was not permitted to have a relationship with him. Despite my compliance, Trey became furious with me for even entertaining a relationship that was not sanctioned by him and encouraged others to report back to him anytime I was seen in public. So in her first chapter, while she's introducing us to her religious trauma, Anderson is recounting the story of a youth pastor named Trey, who Anderson says spiritually abused her. But the story that she tells is how she developed a romantic connection with a high school student, despite being in her 20s. And Trey, this controlling youth pastor, was furious about it. Also, notice how she called the teenager a leader. Just because he was maybe in some leadership development program in the youth group doesn't mean he was a youth leader, an adult who could consent to being in a romantic relationship with her. So that's just another way she is minimizing the seriousness of what she did. This is one of those examples that all of us should have noticed. It was wide out in the open in the very first chapter of her book that so many of us liked. She's an expert on religious trauma whose religious trauma involves a youth pastor reacting strongly against her desire for a high school student. One person told me, they said, quote, "I thought the story was about high control Trey, but in another light, I can see how Trey's high control was about protecting Lucas. Her pursuit was inappropriate, and he was forbidding it forcefully because she refused to hear it." And that's the same dynamic that I was writing about in my piece. And it was the same dynamic that we're seeing in her response. She's essentially consistently claiming that whatever happened that she's being accused of wasn't a big deal, and then she blames someone else. So where do we go from here? Because I've heard a lot of people, they've expressed frustration and they've said, well, who can we trust? Like, is there even a safe space? If you are in the church and you're being harmed, and then you leave the church and you're still being harmed by even non-religious therapists and coaches, like, is there a safe space? And I think one of our responses, and I'm not going to be able to give a full educated plan forward here or anything, but I think one of our responses needs to be that we need to lean into that fear. The fear of there not being a safe space. And I think we need to admit that. Like, when you're living in the tower of conservative evangelicals with the walls they have to keep outsiders out and the floors they have to keep people above and below one another, like, there's also a sense in which probably it feels safe there, despite all of the trauma that it's causing. And when you deconstruct that tower, or when you leave that tower, you can feel like you're in the Wild West, you're in the wilderness, you're in the chasm. And that can feel very unsafe. And I think that we need to name that and say, yes, like, I'm probably not going to be in a place that is perfectly safe for me. And then in that, then begin to cultivate your intuition. Begin to learn to recognize the patterns of abuse and how they show up in the world. And that doesn't have to be that complicated either. Like, Laura released basically like a 2-paragraph statement about the accusations against her. And so you don't need to be able to have the skills to go through and investigate all of these claims and try to figure out who said what and what they said, and feel all the pressure. Like, is this a safe place? Is this not a safe place? You can just learn something simple as how people who are abusive tend to respond. And they tend to respond by minimizing what they do and passing the blame. And then, you can recognize those two things. They're minimizing what they did and they're passing the blame. And so I don't personally tell people that I'm a safe space. I understand the desire for that, for people to think you're a safe space. I don't tell people I'm a safe space. I don't tell people to trust me, because I would rather people cultivate a healthy awareness and intuition by looking out for themselves and loving themselves well than be concerned about getting overly defensive because it touches a soft spot in my ego. And so I think we need to just name the fact that, yeah, there probably aren't safe spaces, and then lean into growing our intuition and our care for ourselves and one another and looking out for one another. And I think that that's a major part of the path forward that we need to have. So the new case with the AAMFT will start in the fall. I'm sure what we've talked about so far is just the tip of the iceberg. There's no way we've unearthed everything here that there is to this story so far. So especially given the amount of fear that the women were facing, as I mentioned in my piece, to talking. So let's be on the lookout for each other. And let's be willing to keep going in our deconstruction, to keep opening up to awareness of the ways that our power dynamics over one another may still be embodied in us. Because it's in that place of awareness that liberation can happen and that wholeness can begin to be felt. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and we'll be back with another episode on Monday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.
This episode was produced and edited by Mac Bowles of TKG Communications, LLC, Dallas, Texas.